Good morning, everybody, and thanks for everyone coming to the session, and thanks to the people who stayed. I'm really glad that my first pitch really worked. Before I start, I'd like to thank ADG Salazar for inviting me to come and talk today, partly because Rome, oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful city. Being invited to Rome, it's great, even if I didn't talk. But again, thanks, Renee, for actually inviting me to do this. The story about forest, wildlife, and food security has been hundreds of thousands of years in the making. But to begin with, let me tell you a little bit about my part in that story, my really tiny part in that story. In 1981, I was lucky enough to travel to the Congo Basin to start working in one of the biggest, most immense, most ancient forests on the planet. I remember, like it was yesterday, being guided through forest trails by Kebe. Kebe was my neighbor, and he was my self-declared uncle. He and his son, you can see Kebe and Itude here, they were teaching me about their forest. They were teaching me the Kiefe names for all the plants and the animals that provided everything that they needed. Food, like this honey. Bark cloth for clothing. Bows and arrows. All their basic needs were met by the forest. Now, I never really understood why Kebe was so kind to me. I even didn't understand why he was patient with me. I am a horrible hunter. Give me a bow and arrow and I cannot hit a damn thing. And as a forest gatherer, hopeless. Without Kebe and his wife Ibuobi, I would be lost. I would not survive in the forest. I'm immensely grateful to Kebe because for 15 years, he was my professor. He taught me to have a passion for saving tropical forests, his forests. And he instilled in me a deep, deep respect for forest peoples. I just walked in just now and I saw Edgardo Benitez. Edgardo comes from Honduras. He's a Tawaka. He was my professor too. I never thought I'd see him here. What fun. Before we invented agriculture about 10,000 years ago, there was only about 3 to 4 million people alive on Earth. And every single one of them was a hunter-gatherer, like my friend Kebe. At that time, forests covered over 50% of the landmass of the planet. That is 75 million square kilometers, a mind-boggling number. Let's fast forward to the 21st century. There is 7 billion people on the planet, and we're racing towards 9 billion people. And agriculture, ranching, logging, building cities, building factories, building roads, has cleared and converted over 50% of the world's original forest cover. And we did it for one purpose. We did it for one species. We did it for us. Wow. The forests today are greatly diminished, but there's still over 40 million square kilometers of forest. They're still immensely important. Today, there are 3 trillion trees on the planet. Each day, every single tree draws carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and converts it into wood. Thank goodness they do that, because those 3 trillion trees sequester over 35% of the carbon dioxide humans emit by burning fossil fuels. If we are to prevent a climate catastrophe, boy, do we need these trees and many more. In Central Africa, every day, trees draw water from the soil and release it into the air. That moisture generates 50% of the rainfall in the Congo Basin. And the trade winds move moisture out of the region, dropping rain in much of the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Trees really matter. Tropical forests are the coolest places on the planet. They're bastions for biodiversity. They're amazing places. They're one of the few remaining places where you get complete assemblages of native plants and animals interacting at ecologically meaningful densities, largely outside the influence of industrial humankind. That's just amazing. These places are really, really cool. But forest wildlife, though wonderfully diverse, are at risk. They're only 1/10 as productive as wildlife on grasslands. Forests don't produce very much wildlife. And you'll learn why that's a challenge in a couple of minutes. And we can't forget that forests are vital to the food security and cultural identities of indigenous people who live in these forests. Today, forests are home to some of the poorest people on the planet. They're isolated from markets. They're the last to receive social services from their governments, if they ever receive social services. And they're almost always politically marginalized. The forest is their lifeblood. The forest is the source of food and shelter, everything they need. And it's the foundation of their cultural senses of self. They are truly forest people. And without forests, they will cease to be. As a conservationist working for the Wildlife Conservation Society, it's always clear to me that forest people are our best allies for conservation, because their interests and our interests are so closely aligned. Forest people depend on wild nature for everything, and so they're our most vocal advocates for forest conservation. And at WCS, they are our most trusted and most effective partners. But pressures on forests are increasing. Big commodities chains are cutting down forests. Wildlife are being depleted. There's a huge risk that we'll lose our forests, lose our forest wildlife, and we put in jeopardy the most imperiled cultures on the planet. For the last 30 or 40 years, all nations have been watching their citizens become increasingly urban. As rural families move from the rural areas into cities and towns, they increasingly become disconnected to nature. And sadly, children born in cities may never be connected to nature in the first place. We all know that cities can't feed themselves. They must import food. And imported food comes from places that city families can't see. I call this over-the-horizon consumption, and it's a real challenge. If a city consumer's choices are not guided or informed by the impact those choices are having on the environment and the people where those foods are produced, they can't make good decisions. I'll give you an example from Boston, where I live. The foods you see here, almost nobody who buys them in the United States knows they all contain palm oil. And most people don't know that cultivating oil palm is one of the most serious causes of deforestation in the tropics. Maybe if they knew where their food was coming from, and if they had affordable alternatives, we might be making different decisions. Turns out that over-the-horizon consumption by city dwellers is now the most significant threat to forest wildlife on the planet. In forest cities, where people don't have access to meat from livestock or farmed fish, everybody eats wild meat. The scale of the issue is astounding. Some work that I did in Gabon, in Libreville, there's 600,000 people there. Every year, those 600,000 people consume 14 million kilograms of wild meat. That's the equivalent of 3 million antelope. Now just think of Kisangani across the border in DR Congo, embedded right in the forest. There's 1 million people there. Then think of Kinshasa. It's got 10 million consumers. Just think of the demand for wild meat in all these big cities. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do to preserve forest wildlife, to secure the well-being and cultural identities of forest people, and equally importantly, to find a sustainable source of food for families in growing cities? We need to do all three of those things. I think there's 3 solutions. We absolutely have to respect and protect the legitimate rights of indigenous forest peoples. That's a given. We need to devolve authority to manage wildlife and forest resources to these local rights holders. We need to help our local partners build the governance mechanisms they need to manage their wildlife and other forest resources sustainably. And most importantly, to prevent outsiders from coming onto their lands, hunting their wildlife, taking their resources without permission. Protecting and respecting the rights of indigenous people, I think, is the most important way that we can stop unsustainable use of wildlife. As my friend Kebe said to me one day as we were sitting in camp in the Ituri, he said, Dowdy, you know, if we finally get legal rights to our land, we will understand that poaching is stealing from us. And you can bet we'll do everything we possibly can to prevent that happening. Second, we need to increase the supply of livestock and farmed fish for growing forest cities. These cities are growing incredibly quickly. In the 1990s, a little town called Nyanya on the border of the Okapi Wildlife Reserve in the Ituri had 5,000 people in it. Today, there are 90,000 people in Nyanya, and they're all still eating wild meat. How's that possible? How's that going to be sustainable? Worse, these towns are barely connected to markets. This is the main road. It's kind of like the roads in Rome. Barely access to, sorry about that. Barely connected to markets. But most importantly, none of these towns have developed the livestock production and marketing systems at a scale that's anywhere close to feeding their own residents. That's why they're continuing to eat wild meat. We need to increase livestock production in order for us to provide a source of nutrition for city families. And increasing livestock production is going to provide new and secure sources of income for people involved in the livestock trade. Lastly, we need to halt luxury consumption. People in big cities still eat wild meat, not because it's a necessity, but because it's a connection to a cultural past. We need to stop that from happening. We've shown in Brazil that we can do this using social marketing. So we really do need 3 solutions to avoid the wild meat crisis. We've lost 40% of our forests. If we lose our wildlife by eating them, the forest will collapse, because most trees and vines need animals to disperse their seeds. There are 11 species of trees in this one pile of elephant dung. If we lose people from the forest, we lose our most vocal advocates for conservation, and we're likely to lose the forest because with nobody there in the forest protecting the trees from being cut down or preventing the wildlife from being hunted to extinction. We have the power and the knowledge to protect wildlife and secure the well-being and cultural identity of all forest people. Together, we should make that happen. Thank you.